For over 1,000 years, the Roman Empire was the heartbeat of the ancient world. It commanded armies, built marvels, and shaped cultures far beyond its borders. But like all empires, its time came to an end. This is the story of how Rome fell, not in a single moment, but in a slow unraveling of power, stability, and identity. Stay with us as we explore the causes, the chaos, and the lasting consequences of one of history's greatest collapses. Part 1. The Golden Age and the Seeds of Decline. The Roman Empire did not collapse overnight. Its fall was the result of centuries of change, some gradual, some sudden, and many of the forces that would ultimately bring Rome to its knees began stirring during its most celebrated years. To understand the fall, we must first understand the empire at its height and the subtle cracks that began to form in its seemingly unshakable foundation. In the 1st and 2nd centuries AD, Rome stood at the pinnacle of its power. Its borders stretched from the misty highlands of Britain to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, from the Atlantic coast of Hispania to the fertile lands of Mesopotamia. The Mediterranean Sea, once contested by rival kingdoms, had become Rome's private highway, a mare nostrum, or RC, patrolled by powerful fleets and surrounded entirely by provinces loyal to the emperor. Trade flourished. Roman engineers built an unmatched network of roads, aqueducts, and ports, ensuring that grain from Egypt, wine from Gaul, olive oil from Hispania, and silks from the East could be transported with remarkable speed. Cities from Carthage to Athens enjoyed grand amphitheaters, bathhouses, and forums that reflected Rome's architectural genius and wealth. Politically, the empire benefited from what historians call the Pax Romana, the Roman peace, a 200-year period of relative stability that began with Emperor Augustus and saw a remarkable absence of large-scale internal conflict. During this time, Roman law spread across the provinces, unifying diverse peoples under a shared legal and administrative system. And yet, beneath this golden exterior, dangerous problems were quietly taking root. The first crack in the foundation was political. Rome's system of imperial succession was never truly stable. Unlike modern nations with clear constitutional guidelines for leadership changes, the Roman Empire relied heavily on the will of the reigning emperor to name a successor, often by adoption or through family lineage. When emperors died unexpectedly or failed to choose wisely, the result was often power struggles, civil wars, and palace intrigue. These struggles drained resources and weakened the authority of central government. Economic strains also began to emerge. Rome's economy depended heavily on conquest. New territories provided not only tribute and taxes, but also slaves, the backbone of agriculture, mining, and even household labor. As the empire reached its maximum expansion under Emperor Trajan, the flow of new conquests slowed. Without fresh lands to plunder, the economy became increasingly dependent on taxing its existing population. This taxation, combined with corruption among provincial governors and tax collectors, placed enormous burdens on the lower and middle classes. A third factor was the growing divide between the rich and the poor. The senatorial elite and wealthy landowners amassed vast estates, often worked by slave labor, while small farmers struggled to compete. Many sold their land and moved to cities in search of work, swelling the ranks of the urban poor. Although Rome provided grain doles and public entertainment, the famous bread and circuses, this policy was more about preventing unrest than solving systemic problems. Culturally, the empire's diversity was both a strength and a challenge. Rome absorbed God's languages and customs from across its territories, creating a cosmopolitan society. But this diversity sometimes led to tensions, particularly when the central government tried to impose uniform policies, or when certain groups resisted Roman authority. Religious unrest, most famously seen in the Jewish revolts of the 1st century, hinted at deeper challenges of governing a vast and varied population. Militarily, Rome still commanded the most disciplined army in the world, but even here, seeds of decline were planted. Traditionally, Roman legions were composed of citizens, men who fought not only for pay, but for the honor of defending Rome. Over time, however, the army relied more on non-citizen recruits from the provinces, and eventually on foederati, allied barbarian tribes who fought in exchange for land or payments. While these troops could be effective, their loyalty was often to their generals or their own people rather than to Rome itself. Another subtle but important factor was the geographic size of the empire. What had once been an advantage, vast resources, trade networks, and strategic depth, became a liability. Defending thousands of miles of borders required immense military spending and constant vigilance. From the windswept frontiers of Britain to the deserts along the Euphrates, legions had to be supplied, paid, and rotated. Communication between distant provinces and the capital could take weeks or months, meaning that local crises often escalated before Rome could respond effectively. By the 3rd century AD, these cracks widened into deep fractures. The Pax Romana gave way to political chaos. Between 235 and 284 AD, a period known as the Crisis of the 3rd century, Rome saw more than 20 emperors, most of whom came to power through military coups and were killed in turn by rivals. The empire fractured into rival states at times, with breakaway regions like the Gallic Empire in the west and the Palmyrene Empire in the east. During this period, external pressures increased dramatically. Germanic tribes such as the Goths, Vandals, and Franks began testing the empire's northern borders, while in the east, the revived Persian Empire under the Sassanid dynasty proved a formidable enemy. Rome's armies could still win battles, but the constant wars drained the treasury and forced the government to debase its currency, leading to rampant inflation. The everyday lives of Romans were changing as well. In cities, unemployment remained high, and the gap between the rich and poor continued to widen. Many urban dwellers lived in crowded, unsanitary conditions in insulae, multi-story apartment blocks that were prone to fire and collapse. Public order increasingly relied on grain handouts and spectacles in the Colosseum to maintain loyalty to the emperor. Religion began to play a transformative role. Christianity, once a persecuted faith, spread steadily throughout the empire, offering spiritual hope and community in troubled times. By the early 4th century, Emperor Constantine embraced Christianity, eventually making it the favored religion of the empire. While this change unified many, it also shifted resources and focus away from traditional Roman institutions, altering the cultural fabric of the empire. Even reforms by strong leaders could only do so much. Emperors like Diocletian and Constantine introduced sweeping changes, from splitting the empire into eastern and western halves for easier administration, to reorganizing the tax system and the army. These reforms temporarily stabilized Rome, but also underscored the reality that the empire could no longer be managed as a single, cohesive entity. By the end of part 1 of this story, we see Rome standing as a giant with feet of clay. It remained awe-inspiring in size and culture, but its political instability, economic troubles, military strains, and overextension had left it vulnerable. The seeds of its decline had been sown long before the final fall, and the coming centuries would see these weaknesses exploited by both internal decay and relentless external pressure. In the next part, we will witness the empire under siege, from barbarian invasions to internal betrayals, as the Western Roman Empire marches, step by step, toward its inevitable collapse. Part 2: The internal decay of Rome. The decline of the Roman Empire was not marked by a single catastrophe, but by a complex and gradual erosion of its foundations. As the 3rd and 4th centuries progressed, economic troubles began to undermine the stability of the empire. Once a network of thriving provinces that generated vast wealth for Rome, the empire found itself grappling with shortages, inflation, and an over-reliance on taxation. The agricultural system, the heart of the Roman economy, was strained by overworked land, decreasing yields, and an increasing number of estates falling into the hands of the wealthy elite who avoided taxes. The common people, who bore the brunt of the burden, found themselves sinking into poverty, often becoming tied to the land as semi-serfs to survive. Currency debasement added to these woes. In an attempt to finance endless military campaigns and administrative expenses, emperors diluted the silver content of Roman coins. At first, this seemed a practical solution, but it eroded trust in the currency. Prices rose sharply, trade became unstable, and the economy suffered from a loss of confidence. Merchants demanded payment in gold or barter, further fragmenting the once integrated Roman marketplace. The empire's inability to control its finances reflected deeper problems: mismanagement, corruption, and a lack of long-term planning. Rome's famed roads and aqueducts still stood, but their upkeep became inconsistent, and the once smooth flow of goods and information slowed. While economic problems mounted, political instability deepened the crisis. The Roman Empire of the late period was plagued by constant power struggles. Emperors rose and fell with alarming frequency, often the victims of palace intrigues, assassinations, or coups led by ambitious generals. Loyalty within the ranks of the military was increasingly directed toward individuals rather than the empire itself. Soldiers pledged allegiance to commanders who promised them land, wealth, or political influence, further eroding centralized control. The empire's vast size meant that a rebellion or usurpation in one region could take months to address, giving rivals the time they needed to entrench themselves. The civil wars of the 3rd century demonstrated just how fragile the imperial system had become. Rome's armies, instead of defending its borders against external threats, were often turned against one another in bloody conflicts for power. Each conflict drained the treasury, reduced manpower, and distracted from the pressing need to secure the frontiers. The people, caught in the middle of these struggles, grew weary of the instability. A sense of disillusionment spread through the provinces. For many, the empire no longer seemed to embody the ideals of stability, protection, and justice that had once made it so formidable. Social changes also played their part. Roman citizenship, once a privilege that conferred rights, prestige, and a sense of belonging to the greatest empire in the world, gradually became less meaningful. By the 3rd century, citizenship had been extended to nearly all free inhabitants of the empire, a move initially intended to broaden the tax base. While it seemed an inclusive reform, it also diluted the sense of special connection to Rome. Local identities began to take precedence over imperial loyalty. In the provinces, people increasingly saw themselves as members of their local communities first, and subjects of the empire second. Religious transformation further altered Rome's identity. The rise of Christianity brought new values and priorities that often conflicted with traditional Roman ideals. While Christianity offered unity through faith, it also shifted attention away from the old civic religion and the emperor's divine status, which had long been a source of political legitimacy. The Christian Church grew in power and influence, sometimes clashing with imperial authority. Resources and attention that might have gone to strengthening the state were instead diverted into religious debates and rivalries. The military, once the pride of Rome, reflected the empire's wider struggles. Recruitment became increasingly difficult among Roman citizens, leading to a reliance on mercenaries and troops from outside the empire. Many of these soldiers were loyal only to their paymasters, and their commitment to defending Rome's interests was questionable. While some served faithfully, others saw military service as a stepping stone to personal gain, or as an opportunity to seize Roman land and wealth for themselves. The empire's enemies were keenly aware of these weaknesses. The northern and eastern borders were constantly tested by incursions from Germanic tribes, Persians, and other groups seeking to exploit Rome's vulnerabilities. One of the most dangerous developments was the gradual infiltration of these so-called barbarian groups into Roman society and even its army. In some cases, whole tribes were settled within the empire's borders as foederati alliances intended to bolster Rome's defense. While this provided temporary relief, it also created a ticking time bomb. These groups often retained their own leaders, cultures, and loyalties, and when tensions rose, they could turn against the empire from within. The cumulative effect of these internal pressures was a slow but steady weakening of Rome's capacity to respond to challenges. Its vast bureaucracy became more corrupt and inefficient, consuming resources without delivering the stability it promised. The ideals that had once united the empire, discipline, civic duty, and belief in Rome's destiny, were fading. As internal trust eroded, so did the empire's resilience. By the 4th century, the stage was set for the external shocks that would ultimately bring Rome to its knees. Part 3: The Final Blows and the Fall. By the late 4th century, the Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its borders were frayed, its armies strained, and its treasury depleted. The internal weaknesses that had been building for centuries were now compounded by a series of devastating external shocks. Chief among these were the relentless pressures from migrating and invading tribes. The Huns, a fierce nomadic people from Central Asia, began pushing westward, driving other groups like the Visigoths, Vandals, and Ostrogoths into Roman territory. These migrations were not small raids, but massive movements of entire populations, desperate for land and security. Initially, the Romans tried to manage these new arrivals by negotiating settlements. In 376 AD, the Visigoths were allowed to cross the Danube River and settle within the empire's borders. In theory, they were to become allies and defenders of Rome, but in practice, the arrangement quickly turned into disaster. Corruption among Roman officials, who exploited and mistreated the newcomers, sparked resentment. Within 2 years, this tension exploded into open conflict, culminating in the catastrophic Battle of Adrianople in 378 AD. The Roman army, led by Emperor Valens, suffered a crushing defeat at the hands of the Visigoths. Valens himself was killed, and the myth of Roman invincibility was shattered. The defeat at Adrianople was more than a military loss, it was a psychological turning point. Rome could no longer command the unquestioned respect or fear of its enemies. Word of the empire's vulnerability spread, emboldening other groups to challenge its authority. Over the next decades, the empire was forced to divert its dwindling resources to plug one breach after another along its borders. Yet for every temporary victory, new threats emerged. The Western Roman Empire, in particular, struggled under these pressures. Unlike the wealthier and more stable Eastern Empire, with its capital at Constantinople, the West lacked the same economic base and defensible geography. Its cities were smaller, its roads less maintained, and its armies often underfunded. The emperors in the West, many of them weak or short-lived, could do little more than react to crises as they came. Leadership changes were frequent, and effective long-term planning was almost impossible. The sack of Rome in 410 AD by Alaric and the Visigoths marked another unprecedented blow. For 8 centuries, the city of Rome had stood as the heart of the empire, untouched by foreign armies. Its capture and plundering sent shockwaves throughout the known world. Though the empire continued to exist after 410, the symbolism of the eternal city being violated was impossible to ignore. Rome was no longer invincible. In the years that followed, the Western Empire became a patchwork of territories, nominally under Roman control but increasingly ruled by local leaders, both Roman and non-Roman. The Vandals seized North Africa, cutting off a crucial supply of grain. The Franks and other Germanic peoples settled in Gaul. Britain was abandoned entirely, left to fend for itself against waves of invasions. Each loss further eroded the empire's cohesion and economic stability. By the mid-5th century, the Western Empire's fate seemed sealed. The arrival of Attila the Hun and his devastating campaigns brought even greater instability. While Attila never captured Rome, the mere threat he posed forced the empire into desperate diplomacy, including the payment of massive tributes. When Attila died in 453 AD, the relief was short-lived. Other groups quickly filled the vacuum, and the empire's final defenses crumbled. The end came in for 76 AD, when the Germanic chieftain Odoacer deposed the last Western Roman emperor. Romulus, Augustus. It was a quiet end for what had once been the greatest power in the ancient world. There was no grand battle, no dramatic last stand-only. The formal recognition that imperial authority in the West no longer existed. The Eastern Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, would carry on for another 1,000 years. But the Rome that had dominated Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East was gone. The consequences of Rome's fall were profound. In its place emerged a fragmented Europe, dotted with kingdoms and tribes, each with its own culture, laws, and ambitions. The vast infrastructure Rome had built, its roads, aqueducts, and cities, fell into neglect in many regions. Trade diminished, literacy declined, and for centuries, much of Western Europe entered what historians once called the Dark Ages. Yet, even in its collapse, Rome left behind an enduring legacy. Its laws, languages, and cultural ideals would shape the emerging medieval world and, eventually, modern Western civilization. Rome's story is not merely one of decline and fall, it is a lesson about the fragility of even the mightiest of powers. No empire, however vast, is immune to the corrosive effects of internal weakness and external pressure. The Roman Empire's fate reminds us that power rests on more than armies and wealth. It depends on unity, vision, and the will to adapt to changing times. And perhaps this is why the fall of Rome continues to fascinate us today. We see in its story a mirror reflecting our own vulnerabilities. We live in a world of great powers, vast economies, and interconnected systems, much like Rome did. Its fall serves as both a warning and an invitation to reflect. If Rome, with all its achievements and resources, could collapse, what does that say about our own future? As we close this journey through Rome's final centuries, we are left with a haunting image: the once great empire, fractured and fading, its marble monuments crumbling under the weight of time. Yet, in those ruins lies a story that refuses today, a reminder that the end of one era is always the beginning of another. And so, Rome lives on, not in its armies or its emperors, but in the memory of what it was and the lessons it left behind. Rome's fall was not the end of history, it was a profound transformation. The empire that once ruled the known world crumbled, but its spirit and influence endured through the centuries. From its laws to its architecture, from its language to its ideas of governance, Rome's legacy shapes our world today. As we reflect on its rise and fall, we are reminded that no power lasts forever without resilience, unity, and adaptability. History is a mirror, and Rome's story warns us to learn from the past as we face the challenges of our own time. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the final chapters of the Roman Empire. Until next time, stay safe and curious. See you in the next Roman Histories video.